What if I told you the Dark Ages were never actually dark, but a wild time when monks, Vikings, and empires were secretly rebooting civilization? Let's talk history while watching completely unrelated footage, just because I don't know how to edit a video. But don't worry, I promise you'll understand history like never before. Or maybe even like it. Probably. You've heard it 1,000 times. The Dark Ages. That gloomy stretch of history when everyone supposedly lost their minds, forgot how to invent stuff, and just sat around in the mud waiting for civilization to restart. Sounds like a medieval version of your Wi-Fi going down, right? Well, guess what? That's a colossal pile of rubbish. The so-called Dark Ages weren't a blackout. They were more like a low-budget indie film that everyone misunderstood as a horror flick when it was actually a subtle drama about survival, reinvention, and a sneaky dash of genius. Why should you care? Because this myth isn't just some dusty old history book nonsense. It's a modern-day poison that whispers societies crumble into chaos and darkness, and there's no coming back. Spoiler alert, that idea feeds into today's fears about social collapse, misinformation spreading like wildfire, and cultural pessimism running wild. Sound familiar? Yeah, history's got receipts, and they're not pretty. So, before we drag the Middle Ages through the mud, again, let's rewind the tape and actually see what went down behind the headlines. Trust me, it's not what you think. Picture this. It's the late 5th century, and the Roman Empire, that once mighty global powerhouse, the OG superpower, is teetering like your nan after one too many sherries. Officially, Rome fell in 476 AD, but spoiler alert, it wasn't like the lights just went out and everyone suddenly forgot how to build roads or bathe regularly. Nope. More like a very messy divorce that took centuries to fully settle. Now imagine Emperor Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman emperor, bless him, getting shown the door by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. Odoacer wasn't exactly a polite houseguest. He basically said, "Right, I'm in charge now, thanks," and tossed out the Roman rulebook like last season's fashion. But instead of plunging Europe into utter chaos, Odoacer and his crew mostly kept the machinery running. Think of it as switching drivers mid-race. The car still moves forward, just with a slightly different style. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, aka the Byzantine Empire, was busy flexing its muscles from Constantinople, keeping the Roman flame alive with a bit more flair and less toga drama. They were the high-maintenance sibling who kept the empire's intellectual and cultural life ticking, sending occasional postcards that said, "We're still here, and we're fancy." Back in the West, things got interesting. Various barbarian groups, the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Franks, and yes, the Vikings, we'll get to those cheeky blokes later, were setting up shop, carving out kingdoms like medieval Airbnb hosts. It sounds messy, but these kingdoms weren't just marauding gangs throwing paint on Rome's walls and leaving. They were establishing new political orders, blending Roman law with their own customs, and sometimes even sponsoring arts and education. Yes, seriously. Meanwhile, the church was stepping up like the ultimate life coach, preserving knowledge, promoting literacy, and running monasteries that doubled as medieval Google. These monks were the real MVPs, copying classical manuscripts by candlelight, making sure Plato and Cicero didn't vanish into the abyss. Without them, your favorite Renaissance geniuses would have had a lot less to binge on. So while Rome was falling, Europe wasn't descending into some kind of cultural black hole. It was more like a complicated renovation project, full of dust, noise, and questionable wallpaper choices, but definitely not abandoned. New technologies started creeping in, agriculture got smarter, hello, heavy plow and three-field system, and trade routes, yes, even the Viking ones, began to stitch the continent back together. And here's the kicker. This period, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 10th century, was a wild mashup of continuity and change, chaos and order, a simmering stew that would eventually cook up the Europe we recognize today. But, and this is important, this simmering stew was never the dark, dead zone you've been told about. That label? Mostly Renaissance-era drama, a little jealousy, and a lot of myth-making. And that's where things started getting dangerous. Fancy a taste of what comes next? Hold tight. We're about to see how those sparks of culture and innovation flickered and flared, despite what the history textbooks might mumble quietly in the corner. So, Rome's fall wasn't the apocalypse, more like a messy Brexit, but with swords and less dignity. The West limped on, patched together by new powers who fancied themselves the heirs to that Roman mojo. But here's the twist. Rather than everything going pear-shaped, a bizarre blend of chaos and brilliance took root. Think of it like a dystopian startup. Shaky beginnings, but some genius ideas brewing in the back room. Take Charlemagne, for example, the OG rebooter. This guy wasn't content just wearing a crown and yelling, "I'm emperor." He launched what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance. Fancy phrase, but basically, he rebooted education, arts, and administration across Europe. Imagine if Elon Musk suddenly decided to build a medieval Tesla, except instead of electric cars, he was pushing literacy and legal codes. Charlemagne wanted to make sure people remembered how to read and write, and crucially, how to think beyond "my sword is bigger than yours." Meanwhile, monasteries? Oh, they were the Netflix of their day, the ultimate binge watch for knowledge nerds. Monks were scribbling away like caffeine-fueled hipsters, copying ancient manuscripts, preserving Roman and Greek wisdom, while the outside world dealt with marauding Vikings and political bedlam. Yes, those Vikings, not just mindless axe-wielding villains, but savvy traders and explorers, linking Europe to the Middle East and even North America. They were basically the medieval FedEx, minus the tracking number. And let's not forget tech. Farming got a serious upgrade. The heavy plow? Game changer. The 3-field crop rotation? Suddenly Europe's food supply was more reliable than a London bus schedule, which is to say it was improving. Watermills spun up production, freeing people from endless manual labor. These innovations fueled population growth, cities expanding, and yes, the slow crawl out of darkness. But if you think all was sunshine and roses, think again. Political fragmentation was a mess, kingdoms popping up like weeds, alliances switching faster than a reality TV show cast. The old Roman order had shattered, and the new one was anything but stable. Feudalism took hold, a complicated web of loyalty, land, and power that basically meant peasants worked the land, while lords played a never-ending game of thrones, minus the dragons, but with all the backstabbing. Now, why does the Dark Ages myth stick like a bad rash? Because it's a fantastic story, simple, dramatic, and a perfect narrative for Renaissance scholars who wanted to roast their medieval predecessors as backward bozos. The truth? The early Middle Ages were anything but stagnant. They were a crucible where Europe survived, adapted, and evolved. But the myth feeds into modern fears, that society can collapse into chaos, that culture can just vanish, and that progress is linear. Spoiler, it isn't. This misunderstanding isn't just academic. It shapes how we see political turmoil, misinformation, and cultural shifts today. When we call something a dark age, we're not just talking about history. We're whispering or shouting that collapse is inevitable, that hope is futile. Dangerous stuff. So the stage is set. A messy, brilliant, volatile period where old powers die, new ones rise, and Europe starts cooking up the recipe for modern civilization. But don't get comfy, because the fallout of these centuries is still simmering beneath our feet. Sound familiar? It should, because we're still dealing with it. Let me show you how this tangled legacy shapes the world you live in right now, from politics to culture, and yes, even the internet trolls. So the Dark Ages myth? It's not just some dusty history lesson to shrug off. Nah, it's like a bad stain on the fabric of how we see everything, from politics to culture to who gets to call themselves civilized. Here's the kicker. This myth shaped modern Europe's self-image and, by extension, how the rest of the world sees it too. Think Brexit-level identity crises, but with crowns and swords instead of debates and ballots. Let's start with governance. That messy medieval patchwork of tiny kingdoms and feudal lords? Guess what? It's the blueprint for a lot of modern political fragmentation. Look at the UK, France, Germany, countries built on a patchwork of old feudal territories with borders drawn by whoever won the last bar fight or marriage deal. And those feudal hierarchies? They laid the groundwork for social classes and power imbalances that still echo today. Fancy a reminder? Check out the wealth gap or political elitism. Still bleeding from it, still paying for it. And culturally, that myth of a dark, ignorant, backward Europe gave Renaissance scholars a massive ego boost, and the rest of us a seriously warped view of history. It's why popular culture loves to paint medieval folks as bumbling peasants or brutal barbarians. Spoiler alert, they were also philosophers, innovators, and world travelers. But no, the Dark Ages label stuck like gum on a school desk, feeding centuries of cultural pessimism. When we hear Dark Ages, we think no progress, just gloom, and that idea sneaks into how societies handle crises today. We assume collapse means total doom, forgetting humanity's knack for resilience and reinvention. Speaking of crises, the cross-cultural exchanges from that era? Game changers that history books often ignore. The Byzantine Empire kept Roman smarts alive. Islamic scholars in places like Baghdad were the ultimate knowledge brokers, reintroducing lost classics and pushing the boundaries of science, math, and philosophy. Vikings weren't just savage raiders, they were merchants connecting Europe to far-flung places, including parts of the Middle East and North America, centuries before Columbus showed up. That early globalization set the stage for the multicultural, interconnected world we're still trying to figure out. Yet, the myth encourages us to see others as threats rather than partners. Cue modern nationalism and xenophobia. History, you cruel teacher. Oh, and let's not forget education and misinformation. The Dark Ages myth justifies a simplistic progress is linear story that everyone swallows whole. It fuels this dangerous idea that if society stumbles, it's all downhill forever. Think about today's debates on misinformation, fake news, and societal decline. People fear going dark, culturally, intellectually, politically, forgetting that history is full of starts, stops, setbacks, and glorious comebacks. And here's a big irony. Those medieval monks you thought were just dusty old bookworms? They were the original librarians and hackers of knowledge. They preserved Roman concrete recipes. Yeah, that stuff that still baffles modern engineers. Copied thousands of manuscripts by hand, and kept classical knowledge alive through centuries of upheaval. Without them, Renaissance thinkers would have had a much emptier bookshelf. So the Dark Ages weren't a cultural graveyard. They were a crucible of transformation, innovation, and survival that laid the groundwork for the modern world. Yet the myth persists, twisting how we see ourselves and others, feeding fears and misunderstandings that still echo in headlines and power plays worldwide. Sound familiar? It should, because we're still tangled in these stories, still wrestling with the legacy of myths we thought we'd outgrown. Oh, and if you think that's wild, wait till you hear what happened behind the scenes. All right, strap in. You think you know the Middle Ages? Ha! You're about to get hit with some medieval nerd candy so sweet, it'll give your history teacher a toothache. Ready for this? No? Too bad. This is the good stuff. First off, monks. Not just pious bookish types praying away the gloom, these guys were basically the original hackers of history. Imagine them as the medieval Netflix, binge-copying manuscripts with the dedication of someone who just discovered a series finale cliffhanger. But here's the kicker. They preserved the secret recipe for Roman concrete. Yep, that magical mortar that's kept ancient Roman buildings standing strong for 2 millennia. While we moderns are still Googling how to make durable concrete, these monks were quietly safeguarding the formula like it was the ultimate Wi-Fi password. Talk about a history-level mic drop. Now, on to the Vikings. And no, they weren't just berserkers in horned helmets smashing stuff. Horned helmets are a Hollywood invention, by the way. Thanks for that, Disney. These were savvy traders, adventurers, and explorers who weren't just raiding monasteries. They were setting up trade routes from Scandinavia all the way to the Middle East. Picture them as the original global shipping magnates with a splash of chaos on the side. They even reached North America centuries before Columbus got credit for the discovery. Vikings, rewriting maps and smashing stereotypes, one longship at a time. And let's not forget the Dark Ages label itself, the ultimate historical roast cooked up by Renaissance scholars who wanted to make themselves look like superheroes of enlightenment. Imagine them sipping wine, toasting, to us, the light-bringers, and to those poor medieval chaps stuck in the shadows. Basically, the 1800s version of a drunk tweet that just never got deleted. But here's the real kicker. Behind all the myths, the chaos, and the darkness was a bubbling cauldron of innovation. Heavy plows that turned farming on its head, water mills powering economies before the Industrial Revolution even dared to dream, and political experiments that shaped the governance systems we wrestle with today. So next time you hear someone casually drop Dark Ages, like it's a synonym for stupidity, remind them of the monks with their secret concrete, the Vikings who were basically the OG entrepreneurs, and the Renaissance posers who invented the insult. Because the real darkness, it wasn't the Middle Ages, it was the history we were told. And that, my friends, brings us to the real kicker. All right, listen up. Here's the big picture, the zoomed-out view that your history teacher definitely skipped because it messes with the neat little narrative they wanted you to swallow. The so-called Dark Ages? Not a blackout, more like a complicated, messy, brilliant remix of survival, reinvention, and stubborn hope. It's the ultimate reminder that history's greatest myths don't just hide the truth, they bury it under centuries of lazy storytelling and cultural snobbery. Now, why does this matter? Because in our obsession with progress and shiny new tech, that myth keeps whispering in our ears. Societies can collapse into total darkness, permanently, no coming back. Sounds familiar? Yeah, it's the same kind of doom and gloom you hear when people freak out about misinformation, social breakdown, or the end of civilization thanks to politics or pandemics. We're still haunted by that false narrative, and it's bleeding into how we judge the world today. Here's the kicker. The real darkness wasn't the Middle Ages. It was the history we were told, a story cooked up to make the Renaissance look like a divine miracle, rather than the messy evolution it was. It's like blaming the blackout on the candle, when actually, the electricity was just rewiring itself. And guess what? That misinformation has consequences, politically, culturally, economically, all because we can't see the gray in our history. We want black and white, heroes and villains. Spoiler alert, history doesn't work that way. So yeah, next time someone lazily drops Dark Ages like it's some universal insult, shut that down. Remind them the Middle Ages were anything but dark. They were the storm before the Renaissance dawn, the groundwork for everything modern Europe. And honestly, the whole modern world stands on. And with that, sleep tight. History's still out here, biting people.